I'm a senior corporate analyst and also a so-called corporate responsibility ambassador, meaning trying to push the message and the new way of working into the organization within ocean industries. I'm excited to be here today at the launch of the report, which we have commissioned, that it's then performed and done by the governance group. And there's no leading. This is totally independent. We have no say in their conclusions. So although we have a few chapters in there where we have kind of conveyed our view, but so it's a good opportunity to get it from the outside, how things look in general, what are the key themes, what are also companies doing. As been said at North Shipping, I think several times already, there's a very clear trend, and we are no exception, that investors and banks increasingly are taking ESG considerations into their decision-making and their capital allocation, their client prioritization. That is not stopping, that's just going to increase. So that's, that involves risks as well as opportunities. However, we still feel that the ESG assessments within ocean industries, if you're using external screening tools, etc., it still has a way to go. I think not all kind of external products we can buy, etc., are equally good on precision and depth of industry knowledge. So it's I think this is a highly welcome report by the governance group to specify in more detail what are the key topics that we as a bank should look for, and also what the company should be aware of and think of also, further, because the big issue is also transparency and reporting. So that's a topic in itself. One thing is the new expectations coming from banks and investors with respect to what companies are expected to do, what kind of practices, what kind of policies, but it's also a matter of transparency and reporting, which also has a way to go. So, Joachim, we are really excited to hear what you have to say.
Great. Thank you, Knut Ola. By way of introduction, I see that my name has been made Spanish there with the QI, but I'm actually Norwegian. Great. Thank you for having us. And as was said, we've just finalized a report for actually this event and for this North Shipping Week. If you want, it's sort of fresh off the press. My colleague Josefina and I have some copies if you are interested. Don't be confused that we changed the photo from the presentation to this one, but you can come have a copy and read more in detail afterwards. If we start with sort of what is driving this, just go to the next slide, or if I have a gadget here. Yep, all right. There. All right. So what's sort of driving this push for ESG? And let me first off start with demystifying ESG. It stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. I'll come back to what specific factors we're talking about for the oceans industry and this report. Often, sustainability and ESG floats a little bit as catchwords without really explaining what are we talking about and what does it mean for the industry and for different actors. But just in terms of overall, what's driving this push on sustainability and ESG are two things, essentially. One is the ethical push from financial institutions, from banks, from other investors who are saying, we don't want to invest in certain areas, and if we're going to invest in them, it comes with requirements. This is obviously the big pension funds, including the Norwegian pension fund, but also banks and others are saying that there are ethical guidelines, either environmental or social, on what we want to invest in. So this is creating a sort of exclusion area also for companies on practices and companies that don't fit these requirements. Now, this ethical governance is also quickly becoming law. It's going from soft to hard. And I'll come back to the EU is one of the main drivers of coming with hard requirements to the financial industry, which then trickles down to companies in terms of what you should and should not be doing. Now, the second part that is driving this whole ESG and sustainability push is the belief that companies that do well on ESG also give a better return, that there's a financial correlation between taking sustainability seriously and doing well as a company. And there is evidence, and we'll show this also, between the listed companies that score well on ESG tend also to create value, more value for its shareholders. So financial analysts and banks are interested essentially in sustainability because there's an ethical requirement and because it's giving better returns. Now, when it comes to the report, what we've started with is that this sort of push for sustainability, it's not practice yet, meaning that there's a lot of talk about it, there is a lot of expectations, but it hasn't been fully integrated yet in terms of how bankers and how analysts select companies. But we believe this is going to change and is changing very rapidly for the two reasons that I mentioned. Now, one of the challenges with ESG in general is that the standards and the metrics, they're not standardized. In the same way that for financials and indicators, if you're looking at price-earning ratio or other things, these are standard quantitative indicators that you can get. This is still lacking for ESG, but it is quickly becoming more standardized. And as I said, the EU is really pushing this. They're coming with a sort of standardized taxonomy for sustainable finance. In many ways going from words to practice in terms of what on environment, on emissions, in terms of transparency generally on companies are required to report across the social, environmental and governance spectrum on information that is relevant to shareholders. So again, this is going from soft to hard, and for companies it's a lot about staying ahead of the curve in terms of reporting on whether it's emissions or human rights. This is something that's going to be required through EU legislation. And this is sort of one of the main conclusions of the report, is that companies and financial markets should prepare for stricter ESG requirements. So I think this has real implications for corporates, for boards and management on how you position yourself in the oceans industry, be it shipping or seafood. How do you disclose information about your environmental and social footprint? Now, in terms of the report, what we've looked at specifically, there are sort of three facets. The first is that we have looked at the 33 largest shipping and seafood companies on the Oslo Stock Exchange, which is a good proxy as one of the most important marketplaces for these two industries. The second area that we have looked at is with our partner Arabesque, which is a global ESG data provider. They have not just looked at the Oslo stock market, but they have essentially looked at thousands of companies listed on different markets, categorized in these two sectors to see how these ESG parameters perform when it comes to companies. The third area is, as Knut Ola mentioned, is DNB's own requirements. How are they, as a key bank, a financial actor in shipping, oceans industry in general, what are they asking their clients as a lender? What are their ESG requirements and what are they expecting from companies? In terms of the companies that we have looked at on the Oslo Stock Exchange, you'll see the group here in shipping and seafood. Always a little bit hard to agree on sort of sectors here. The definition on shipping has been those that have a fleet, that have maritime assets. So you'll see there are some what you may associate to be more oil and gas companies. On seafood, again, it is the value chain for seafood. So companies that provide stock or feed or actually do production, there are included. Now, again, ESG, what do we mean? One of the key messages of the report and one of the key advisory services that we do as the governance group is helping companies identify what environmental and social and governance issues are relevant to your company. There's been a little bit of a trend to say that we support sustainability or being green and environmental friendly is important without saying what are actually the areas that matter to your sector and to your company. Where do ESG issues pop up as risks and opportunities? So generally, what we've looked at when it comes to the shipping industry, you'll see them here under the rubric of environment. is obviously emissions and energy reduction. I think some of the other panelists will be speaking more about that as part of the decarbonization trend. Ship recycling, obviously, is something that has received a lot of attention. The life cycle of a ship, especially the decommissioning, what happens with it at the end. The controversy, obviously, of shipbreaking in countries that may not have high standards. So this is both an environmental but also a reputational risk to companies that don't disclose information on how they, what they do with their ships. Under social labor rights and even instances of modern slavery is a topic that's received a lot of attention. I believe there are even some other talks during North Shipping specifically on human rights and shipping. And diversity, equal opportunity, these are sort of key issues that come up in the sector and for the companies that belong to it. On governance, obviously, the political accountability issues in terms of where ships are registered, under what tax or governance authority do they belong, transparency challenges often associated with that. Again, this is something where there is an expectation that there is more information shared, that there's more transparency. Now, if we jump to the seafood industry and the key concerns there under ESG, a little bit different. Obviously, it has more to do with fish health and welfare, biodiversity. Fish feed is increasingly becoming an area that is scrutinized in terms of, in terms of where even the impact it has on rainforest. A lot of the soy production comes from Brazil, going to fish feed, if it be in Norway, Chile, or Scotland. So again, it's this sort of awareness about your value chain and your footprint on this. So again, this is where companies are being scrutinized. Where do you have a negative and in some cases also positive impact? Because obviously fisheries and shipping also contribute in a positive way to the sustainable development goals. Again, if we look at the governance side on the seafood industry, there are controversies surrounding, especially more from a Norwegian perspective, in terms of a natural resource tax. What do they pay for using public utilities or public goods, the seas? But also, again, when it comes to the environment, a key issue here is obviously climate change. With rising ocean temperatures, how will this affect the seafood and the aquaculture industry? Not so much about their own emissions, but how is this going to change their ability to produce fish? Will it hurt them? How are they positioning themselves? This is key information, not just from an ESG perspective, but from a financial perspective. Are you essentially well prepared for more extreme weather, for environmental changes that may affect your production? So we look at these topics in the report, and what we've done then is we've ranked the companies using a scale of 1 to 4 on how much information we find along these parameters. I won't go into too much detail on these standards. You can read more about it in the report. But just to highlight, for example, the GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, is the sort of de facto ESG disclosure used by companies. There's a long list of disclosures with defined areas in terms of emissions, in terms of anti-corruption, across the spectrum where you have to fill in information and it's made publicly available. So we've scrutinized companies to see if they follow the GRI standard. Another one is obviously more related to emissions, and I think what we'll speak about shortly in terms of a company's own emissions, but also climate risk, as I mentioned. The TCFD has a tool for companies to see how well prepared are you on 3 areas. One is the actual physical risk when it comes to climate change, the extreme weather, which obviously affects shipping and seafood in profound ways. Second is the regulatory risk, the transition and the requirements coming, if it's IMO or other requirements for ships and seafood. Is your company basically well prepared for this regulatory transition, which is coming? And the third is about liability, and we're seeing this more as a real risk area on climate, Insurance companies and others are holding companies liable for not being well prepared for climate risk. If it is a hurricane, or if it is a extreme temperature that essentially changes the conditions for an aquaculture area, you may be held liable because you haven't prepared for this. Now, in terms of the actual ranking of companies that we've based on those stock exchange, these are the 5 companies that we find to report, provide the best reporting or disclosure along these parameters within shipping and within seafood. This is not to say that these companies are perfect, but they do better than other companies in terms of making this information available. And for us, the sort of sustainability transparency is not about if you are in a clean or dirty sector, meaning if you're in renewables or oil and gas. It's about how transparent are you with the information on environment, social and governance. It's not about the sector as such. But these are companies that have scored quite well. Now, briefly, it's not in the presentation, but in the report, the Arabesque data, which shows the global perspective, how companies do, shows also some interesting correlations between stock performance and ESG rating. Now, the key message from the Arabesque work here is that companies are being rated. DNB uses what's called the MSCI and Sustainalytics, which are, again, global rating agencies on ESG, which gives a score for a company, a quantitative score, how well they do on environment, social, and governance issues. This score is being used to measure and evaluate companies. So whether if the company likes it or not, they're in this universe of being rated in the same way that they could be rated on credit and receiving A or AA or AAA. So I think this is another key finding, is that companies need to have a strategy or sort of conscious approach here, because they are being rated one way or the other on environmental and social issues. Now, again, in terms of key findings, looking also how shipping compares to seafood, the general finding is that shipping is lagging behind in terms of disclosures, in terms of performance on ESG. It is not doing as well as the seafood. It is a sort of laggard overall as a subsector. Our hypothesis is that there is less pressure on shipping than there is on seafood. Seafood is still a customer-driven business where there's a product being sold, while shipping is still mainly business to business. There isn't the same sort of ESG dynamic and perhaps reputational risk that as there is for seafood. Now, the other thing that we find is that on climate change and climate risk reporting is poor in both industries. None of the industries are really prepared or provide the necessary information for you as a shareholder or an analyst or a stakeholder to understand how are they positioned when it comes to climate risk for the areas that I mentioned about extreme weather, the physical risks of climate, the regulatory change, and also the liability. In general, companies in seafood and shipping do not provide enough information on how this is at the executive or at the company level as a real risk area. So that's another key finding. And our third sort of finding or recommendation here is that until regulators have clear established guidelines, companies both in shipping and seafood would do well to disclose concrete information on these ESG issues that are material to their businesses. Again, the type of ESG issues that I highlighted previously. Now, just to round off in terms of our recommendations here, mainly to companies, company management and boards, is it's essential to know and manage your ESG risks. And for you to do that, you need to have what we call materiality assessments, where you discuss internally and with your key stakeholders, if it's either your bank, your shareholders, or others who have an interest in your industry, what do you think we should focus on? What's key to our company, our industry, based on operations, presence, identify these ESG issues, and then closely monitor them, internalize them, create key performance indicators, make sure that disclosures and reporting include these areas. And another recommendation we come with is to have board oversight, that the boards have been a little bit too lax when it comes to ESG issues. CSR is typically a sideshow. It's a little bit more about charity. It's not something that is core to business and thereby core to the attention of the board. We think this is changing very quickly and that boards would be well advised to pay more attention to ESG issues. Now, the final recommendation is about the opportunities. I've been mainly speaking about requirements, risk, liabilities when it comes to ESG, but there are obviously some huge opportunities also when it comes to financing. Being able to tap into green finance is a huge opportunity for all companies in shipping, in seafood, and a lot of financial institutions are sort of nudging this transition by providing better financial conditions and access. If it's green bonds, blue bonds, if it's essentially also on project financing, there are opportunities if you are ahead of the ESG curve. I will end there in terms of our report. Just to mention that we also give out an annual report on the ESG 100 on the Oslo Stock Exchange across sectors. And we also do other reports on topics such as geopolitical risk, which we think are important for this sector and others. But I will end there and happy to address questions or comments to the report. And as I said, feel free to pick up a hard copy from myself or my colleague Josephine, who's sitting at the back here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joachim. You say that. Just one, before I bring in the other panelists up, you mentioned during the early part of your presentation that the companies that have actually demonstrated good ESG have actually had a better return. And you said there were some examples of that. Why do you end up getting a better return from having ESG? I'm not saying you shouldn't, but why?
Yeah, so I mean, this is still sort of research that is catching up, but there are a lot of studies coming out now with sort of historical data showing that those who have taken ESG seriously have had better returns. There's a very influential study by George Serafeim at Harvard, who's gone back 10, 15 years. And the correlation is essentially that, you know, ESG matters. It is a material risk. So companies that have been paying attention to this have both steered clear of risks and probably found opportunities, and that there is a correlation there. You know, it's hard to say there's a causal effect, but there is also the fact when it comes to risk is that if you get it wrong, it can be catastrophic. The reputational risk of not paying attention to ESG, and we've seen this with ship recycling, for example, companies, including in Norway, that did not follow the sort of advice there, have essentially been thrown out of the investment portfolios of some of the very big banks and investors. They've divested from such companies. So there are some very concrete examples of how you will perform worse and not have access to capital if you don't take these issues seriously.
Thank you. Can I ask our panelists now to come up to the front? So we have here Professor Alan McKinnon, Diane Gilpin and Gavin Allwright, as well as we heard from Knut Ola Skotved from DNB earlier on, just before Joachim came onto the stage. And
Cheers.
As we're just getting ourselves comfortable, I just wanted to go back to you, Knut Ola. Gavin, stop talking to him. I am. Knut Ola, please. When we heard from Joachim, he was talking about the DNV approach towards this. And from your perspective, when you're looking at customers, are you finding yourselves having to explain ESG more and more to them? Or are they really taking on board what it's all about and understanding what the risks are as they come looking for loans or investment, etc.?
That's a good question. In the beginning, we had to explain it more and more. Now I feel we have to explain it less and less, because it's sinking in, and it's from many companies it's just been welcome, and in many areas they are far ahead already. We just haven't been asking the questions, but while there also are laggards, obviously. And we knew that when we started doing it initially. You know, in the old times, we only dealt with ESG issues when we knew we had one. You know, kind of risk-based approach. It was obvious, so here were some ESG risk issues, and we dealt with them in our internal decision-making. Now we screen all clients. And it's maybe had a little tough start in the beginning, because we were asking for a lot of questions, and you know, coming back to what Joachim presented, you know, they were not all equally open and transparent about it. And some actually were doing a lot of things, they were just not systematic in talking about it, while others were maybe not having the same level of firm procedures and policies in place. So it's, but you know, our asking for it has also triggered more and more companies to start working on it.
Something like this, you mentioned this European, potential European regulation that's actually going to create some sort of definitions of ESG, I guess is what you're saying. That will no doubt help you, because then you'll be comparing apples with apples, because all of the companies will have the same definitions of what they mean about everything to do with environment and sustainability and governance. Then everybody will be talking from the same page, and then when they talk to you or one of your competitors, they'll know what to talk about, they'll know what you're going to talk about and the others are going to talk about. Would that make a more level playing field, or would that be more difficult for you?
No, I think overall it's a good thing and help creating a level playing field. The interesting thing, or perhaps challenging thing, is that EU is sometimes moving ahead of the rest of the world, and shipping is a truly global industry. And in some cases, you know, EU, you know, if the Asian ship owner with very little business in Europe, you know, why should I follow EU rules? But there's always been this discussion in shipping whether it's a good thing that some regions or some countries run ahead, or whether we should do wait for the global regulations, because in certain cases it's been shown that regional regulations running first actually are slowing down the implementation of global regulations, while in other cases it has had the opposite effect, that EU is pushing and then the rest are coming along.
And when we're looking at the whole decarbonisation story here, we look at the new technologies, the new solutions, the ideas that are emerging, and we've got other sessions during the course of today and tomorrow where we look at some of these novel ideas and these novel solutions to see whether they're actually going to fly and whether they're actually going to get the investments that they need to actually work. But it was notable a few years ago when I was interviewing some of the insurance companies, and I talked about technology on ships, particularly here, and they said if it's a new technology on a ship, it's a risk. And if it's a risk that it might not work, it might impact the resale value of the asset. Therefore, the premiums have to go up, because we see that as a risk. That is a detriment to actually creating this decarbonisation circle.
Absolutely. And you know, if it's unproven technology and you don't know if it's accepted by the market or not, that whether the shipping company will get a premium from their clients, etc. It's always better when you have a business case, an actual cargo owner asking for that kind of development, that kind of improvement. And I think the role of the cargo owners is key in actually getting things going faster when it comes to decarbonization.
Professor McKinnon, you wrote the book.
A book.
Well, you wrote a book. Well, you called it Decarbonising Logistics, I believe. So you're looking at the whole chain here. And where do you see shipping fitting into that chain? Because you've got different sectors within the logistics industry. And 5 years ago, the shipping industry was, the maritime industry, seemed very insular from the rest of the logistics chain.
Yes.
But I've seen a lot more stories, a lot more collaboration, particularly in the container logistics, that are integrating things more. Is that helping?
Yeah. I always argue we should be looking at decarbonisation at a supply chain level, looking at the end-to-end supply chain, where the shipping is merely one component part in that chain. If you look at the research in this area for a sample of global supply chains, for containerized traffic, I mean, the shipping, the deep sea shipping part would be about 60% of the emissions. Your interland transport could be around, say, 30%. The port emissions are very small typically, maybe 2 or 3%. So clearly, to get maximum leverage on the footprint of the entire chain, you've got to focus on the deep sea shipping part of the operation, no question. But we shouldn't overlook the interdependencies between the deep sea part, the port, and the hinterland transport, and also to see this as a multi-stakeholder enterprise. I often refer back to the IMO's second greenhouse gas study back in 2009, when they said if we're going to decarbonize shipping, it's going to involve all these stakeholders, including the shippers, the cargo owners. And it was a 200-page report, and at no point do they mention the role of the shippers in helping to assist this process as well. But I think we're now seeing greater engagement of all the players in the supply chain to try to work together to drive down emissions.
Do you also see better engagement in terms of investment in those solutions and in those ideas? Is there more of an appetite, not so much into, because Joachim, you were talking a little bit more about, you know, the investment appetite in those companies that had good ESG reporting structures, to have the transparency. But what about the solution providers that are going to provide the answers here? Is there an appetite for those kind of companies that are providing the solutions?
Was that to me? Or, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's going to be extremely expensive to decarbonize shipping, no question. And we'll have to plough a lot more investment into that. To broaden it out even beyond decarbonisation, because reference has been made to the adaptation aspects of, because our supply chains, our logistics are going to be extremely vulnerable to climate change. And currently, the investment is heavily skewed into mitigation of the reduction of the emissions and relatively little into the adaptation and climate proofing. So I see that balance tilting through time as well. But decarbonising shipping, I mean, we're dealing with long life assets here. I mean, I think the average ship is 21 years old. It's going to take us a long time to replace the existing vessels with new, more energy efficient ones that can handle different energy sources. But we have to make that investment very quickly and deliver these deep cuts.
Yeah, okay.
No, just briefly, I think from the financial perspective here, it's essentially setting requirements and maybe caps on emissions, saying, you know, X% need to come from renewable sources, X can be dirty. How you fix that is up to the company in terms of if you find some very innovative ways, or if you cross the board mitigate in terms of making your gas and oil emissions more efficient. That's kind of up to the company. But what's really driving this is you're going to see some hard caps and requirements and saying overall we're not going to accept investing in a company that has 90% of its fuel from fossil. And I think the other thing driving here is also at the end of the day are consumers. You know, consumers are pushing both on banks and end products of saying we don't want to be part of a supply chain that is not sustainable. Yep. So I think that's a very driving force.
And this is why I invited Di to come here today, because Diane Gilpin is part of this kind of alliance, I'll say, where you've got a UK power company, you've got a Danish ship owner, a large ship operator with large tonnage, dry bulk tonnage, and a design company, and you're looking at the wholesale, the way of putting a wind-powered assist solution onto there. And the company is Drax, and they're importing wood chip from America to a plant in the UK. So they've got a renewable plant, and they're wanting to have some form of decarbonisation in their supply chain. Exactly as you're saying, they're trying to demonstrate a wholesale, you know, a larger part of that answer. So when you're looking at this kind of solution, Diane, you're looking at how you're bringing in a wind assist solution onto a vessel, and it's part of that whole chain that you're talking about. What kind of discussions are you having then with Drax, who are looking at a ship and just going, well, it's a ship, we need that to go from here to here? Why are they so keen on having a novel technology, which is a risk, as we identified, it's a risk to put onto a ship, and the ship operator, an owner itself going, do I really want that contraption on my steel hull? Because if I want to sell it in 10 years' time, it might not be worth as much.
Okay, so the answer is systems. And we're picking up on all of the points that have been making here. Firstly, I'd point to Joachim's point about sustainability. So when we think about sustainability, we're thinking about sustainability in the widest sense of the word. We want to create businesses that are sustainable now and in the future. And the way to do that is to find an organized transition away from dependency on fossil fuels. Drax are the leading decarbonisation project in Europe, so they know about moving away from coal. They know about the challenges. So they're really inspirational to have at the other end of our system solution. So at our end, we have the design technology, and at the other end, we have the shipper. And then in the middle, we've got the component parts that need the inspiration and the motivation to decarbonise. And so what we've been working with is really understanding what the ship owners need to achieve, really understanding what the shippers need to achieve, what speeds do we need to operate, what technical challenges have we got getting in and out of ports? What will the crew do? We've interviewed all of those component parts of the system, and we're now analysing the performance results of wind technology on the route that we're looking at, which is US to UK and back. And they're looking very promising. And you know, from a financial perspective, if you can save a double-digit percentage of fuel, and I know you're going to push me on that, but if you can save that, it makes two benefits. It mitigates two risks. One is the volatility of fuel cost and availability, and the other is the ability to future buy fuel against that certainty. So it's bringing all of the parts of the system together, putting the challenge on the table. We want to produce a 100% renewable powered ship by 2030. How do we do it? And understanding what all of those component parts need to achieve within that. And just one little point about insurance. We have an insurance company, Willis Towers Watson, in our consortium, and they are driven by some of the blue bond type ideas that are being developed at EU level. And so if you talk to that part of these big conglomerates, they're really interested in de-risking their exposure to maritime risk. So they're looking at how do we produce a product that would insure against the risk of the wind not blowing.
Not blowing. Who's on that?
I'm very happy that Diane is balancing the idea of risks and new technology, because it's much more complex than where we left it last time. It's there's a lot to gain of just changing. According to IMO, I think I read somewhere that 75% of the emissions can be cut by operational measures and implementing already existing technologies. I'm not a technician, so I cannot vouch for that number, but I read it, and it's obvious that you can come a far way by doing measures with existing technologies.
The question would be, who pays for that, though?
No, but just look at the new designs. Just taking traditional technology, the kind of slow evolution there. That will not give us the big leap to fully decarbonization, but just looking at the tanker from 2000 versus one built last year. It's an enormous reduction in the fuel consumption. So, there's a constant evolution also going on, and with huge possibilities to already start reducing today, and also implement some of these transitional technologies while waiting for the final solution, whether it being ammonia or hydrogen, etc. I wouldn't know what would be the end game or the end solution, but someday that will come.
Before I go to Alan here, I just want to bring in Gavin, please, because you represent the International Windship Association, so you've got a range of different members who have got different solutions in different stages of their evolution. Some of them may work, some of them may not, some of them already have systems on ships to demonstrate and prove some sort of value of their system. But generically, when it comes to these solutions onto the ships, how confident are they that they're going to actually be part of the solution? And what do they say about the investment appetite for the clean tech solutions on ships?
So you're asking me about the from the technology companies.
From the technology companies, what do they say about the investment appetite for their systems? Are companies going, yeah, I like the idea of this, I'm going to invest?
Yeah. Well, I think we've seen a dramatic change in the perception in the industry, at least since April last year, and the IMO initial strategy announcement of at least 50% decarbonisation. And from what I've seen and all of the feedback that I'm getting from my members is that engagement has gone up 2 or 3 notches. Is that backed up with money on the table? Increasingly, there's a change in view that one of the risks that we're not talking about here is having a risk of a stranded asset in the future. So as ship owners are looking to retool or retrofit vessels, but also what is going to be replacing them, if they tie in again to a fossil fuel technology or fuel system, that poses a significant risk in the future. And I don't think that risk is being factored into the market substantially enough at the moment. So I would say that actually our technology providers, and we've got some quite big players now, MOL, Maersk are testing some of these systems, Viking Lines here, and others. Renault's just come in as a...
But is it the ship owner then? Is it the MOLs and the Maersks that are making that investment step, but not the financial institutions?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's very, very fragmented. I mean, the small ship owners, they will be looking for finance. These larger ship owners with vessels available with internal finance or additional funds that are very easy for them to access, yes, they can take those risks, if you like. The smaller ship owners, and that's the vast majority of operators that are operating very small fleets, that's a much bigger ask. And the finance, yes, there is some movement, but it's still, I would say, quite early on in the market at the moment.
Yeah. Just before I go to you, Joachim, I just wanted to ask Alan there. You sort of nodded then when Gavin referenced the fact that the large part of the shipping industry is made up of very small players, really, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, we talk about consolidation in the industry, and it's happened, but it's got a long way to go.
Yes.
In reality. So how is that going to impact your view of the decarbonisation of the whole logistics chain when there is such fragmentation?
It's not just in shipping, it's across logistics. If you look at trucking, for example, I mean, you've got exactly the same problem. I mean, it's made up of lots and lots of small companies. And it's getting the message across to them initially, but also finding ways of getting enough capital into that sector, to make the necessary changes. It's going to be tough. But that relates to the more general point I was going to make, and it actually will culminate with a question for Diane. If one looks at the most recent projections from the International Transport Forum, they reckon that by 2050, there'll be a threefold growth in the amount of freight movement worldwide, and 75% of that will be on the high seas. It'll be shipping related, right? Now, it's going to be enormously difficult to meet the IMO carbon reduction targets, given that underlying growth in demand. I mean, all the emphasis is on reducing carbon intensity, and we can probably do that using all the measures that have been described. But if in the meantime, the underlying growth of freight is going to be the problem. Now, some things will help. So getting out of fossil fuels means we will not be transporting so much coal, oil, and gas. And I think last year, coal, oil, and gas represented about 40% of freight moved by sea, okay? But that will have to be replaced by the materials we will need for the renewable energy infrastructure, and also biomass, which brings me to the question I was going to pose to Diane. So why does Drax in England have to bring biomass from the US? I mean, couldn't it source it locally and thereby reduce the demand for shipping across the Atlantic?
So thank you. I'm not really a spokesperson for Drax, but I think my sense of the way that we are moving in the world is through transition. And the question I would ask is it better to be moving biomass than it would be to be moving coal, which is what Drax did before?
Sure.
And my answer to that, as a citizen of the world, is I prefer biomass to coal. I don't think that it's a static solution. I think we are moving forward. We're seeing Drax now moving into the hydrogen and the BECCS, the energy capture and the emissions capture and storage. So I think what we have to accept is that we can't, I mean, we've already established that it's complex and expensive. We can't just go from where we are today to a 100% decarbonised solution by 2050 without making some transitionary, I hesitate to call them mistakes, but challenge. We've got to start to. It's a complex system, and there's lots of activity, and some of it will be better than others. So for me, it's about risk, and the risk of coal seems to be greater than the risk of biomass. Why does it have to come from the US? Because there's a ready market there, and so I think, and it's we just don't have enough land mass in the UK. They do also import quite a lot from the Baltics and other northern states.
I'm just going to go back to Joachim, because you had a point to make a second ago.
No, just to pick up on the point that was made here by Gavin on stranded asset. I think that's key. This whole sustainability business, at the end of the day, it has to be about cost. It has to have a financial cost or opportunity. In this hall here, we have all the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, projected here. I used to work for the United Nations for almost 12 years, and that's great with SDGs. But unless the things we want to achieve on sustainability have a financial implication, it's not going to happen. So this whole, the details we're speaking about here is a cost-benefit analysis, about new technology, about the transition. So the whole, what the market is trying to do now from the sort of investor perspective, and the big money, is to sort of nudge and create market conditions that would allow for more sustainable outcomes. And that's the big driver. There are going to be anomalies, there are going to be sort of hiccups along the way, but that is really the big driver, that big money and capital is sort of moving and trying to find requirements, carrots and sticks, if you like, along the way to do this transition. But the idea of stranded asset, I think, is really important, for ship owners and others in the industry, because it is essentially, do you want to take a risk of sitting with an asset that is worth a lot less in 5, 10, 15, 20 years because of what's happening on climate risk? And again, it's the risk with the asset. It's not your own emissions. It's basically sitting with something that's not worth a lot because market conditions have changed due to sustainability.
But does that, I'm going to take that, just going back to one of the points you made in the middle there, and put it to DNB, because he was talking about a vast amount of money coming into the industry, but at the same time we're talking about lots of small players in the industry. How can you turn to the small players and see the value then if it's going to be involved in such large amount of money? Can you still turn around to the small players who may not have the economic clout, may have a series of assets? Let's say they've got 5-year-old tankers and they realise they might become stranded assets in 10 years' time, but that's all they've got. How do you play with those companies?
Well, the short answer is probably we don't play much with them, and because that's a huge challenge. Because we're already seeing, or have seen for a long while, kind of two-tier market, where due to some kind of shipping market fatigue after the financial crisis and new banking regulations coming in, that the traditional large, very often Western shipping banks, not only, focusing narrower and narrower, wanting to do more with the bigger and the better companies, who also are the ones in the lead when it comes to developing solutions, not always, but sometimes. While there are fewer and fewer alternatives on finance available for the smaller companies. So that is a challenge, and it just simply because history on losses and returns and the regulations, it doesn't really pay to take, it's often associated with higher risks. It's often associated with also higher ESG risks. So they tend to be kind of selected away. So.
And I'm going to take that just one step further to Gavin and to Di. Either one of you could answer this question. A lot of the projects that I've seen of wind assist solutions that have gone onto vessels have been very project-based, unique, one-off projects that have happened, demonstration projects that have happened, and a lot of them have got funds to help them do that from the European Union or other bodies to help them achieve that. When are we going to see mass-produced wind assist solutions that can be put onto tonnage, whether it's specific tonnage or otherwise, that can actually be part of this solution?
Can
and
I
what
take
needs,
that?
and the other part of that question, what do we need to do within the various companies that are in this game, whether it's the finance companies or the companies that you need to work to in terms of how their ESG is seen, what do they need to do for that to happen? What do you need the other players in the industry to do to change for that kind of mass-produced solution to appear?
Okay, good. Thank you for the question. We need to produce a business case. To your point, we absolutely need to produce a business case, and that is exactly what the consortium that I lead is doing. So as a small company, what we've done is brought together a group of large corporates and have stimulated value flows that they can visualize in that through wind. And the reason that we can do that is that unlike any other fuel, wind is free. And so what that does is it means that whilst you have additional capex, which will increase the original cost of the asset, as you move forward, it is more risk resilient because it's not tied to markets, whereas all the other fuel types are. So what that does is it gives you a great deal of certainty, and certainty is really important as we go into this uncertain world. So what we've been doing is creating that business case without, well, I say without, we have a tiny, almost homeopathic amount of support from the British government. It's mostly to do with the corporate players who are joining the consortium. And the aim is to put a demonstrator on the water. Because without demonstrators, we will not see a fast uptake of this technology. Because there's always this, oh, well, after you, first mover business. So I think that's what we need to do, and it will do two things. One, it will give the market confidence, and the other is it will teach us more about the technology. So my background from renewable energy was that we put the first wind turbine up, which was 45 kilowatts, was on one hill in Ireland. And now we see fleets of 12 megawatt floating offshore. You put the demonstrator on, and then industry piles in behind it once it shows the business case, and that's our purpose.
Kevin.
Yeah, if I could just add to what Diane's just been saying. I mean, the business case is extremely important, and looking at different aspects and different ways, and I know Diane's been looking at some of these aspects, things like leasing the equipment, modularization of wind propulsion technologies, and of course other technologies as well. When you've got a battery pack in a container being put on a deck, plugged into an electric drive, that can be spun out for a fuel cell when that comes online, or another system. So that type of rethinking the way we look at it with heavy capex, light opex, but actually swapping that over. And also giving the option to ship owners where you're de-risking that. You're actually saying, look, if we don't come up with the reductions in your fuel costs, we'll guarantee the first 50% to you, and we'll take the cream on top. And if it overperforms, everybody's happy. So it's those type of models that I think the industry and technology providers are certainly looking at those, but the industry needs to be embracing those a little bit more, just as aviation has embraced, the leasing of Rolls-Royce engines. Why aren't we doing that in shipping? It's fairly, I think, a natural progression.
We're going to run out of time, unfortunately, because I'm going to wrap this up. But to Knut Oller, as the sponsor of this session, I'm going to give you the last word.
I just want to pick up what Gavin said and what also Diane said. I think it's a need to get this moving, to have a fresh look at the business models. In Norway, we love to talk about Yara Birkeland. It's a fantastic project because of both no emissions as well as autonomy, but also interesting because you have a cargo owner not going to any ship owner, going directly to the technology company and creating a solution, and then who builds it, who owns it, etc. That comes in much later. And as Mr. Bhatti from BHP said at the main conference yesterday, I wouldn't put it that hard, but he said, who needs a broker, who needs an owner if they don't add value? I think overall the idea, at least from my point of view, is that we need maybe to challenge the whole business model. Who does what, who owns what, etc., and look at it in a completely new way.
Good. Knut Oller and the rest of the panel, Gavin, Alan, Joachim and Di, thank you very much. And as Di just highlighted to me, tomorrow afternoon we've got the think tanks starting. And in the afternoon we've got a think tank day dedicated to decarbonisation. I've invited Di Gilpin to moderate that for me. And she'll be looking at the very active route to decarbonisation that we're going to take within the shipping industry. And it's not going to be an easy talk, I don't think. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you.